Welcome back to the channel, y'all. I'm Scotty G, back at it again. Today's a big episode for me. I know that marriage has changed over the years. I'm not that guy that's trying to convince you to get married and trying to change the world. What I'm trying to do is trying to talk to people that want to get married, want to have a great marriage, want to have a sexy marriage, one that lasts a lifetime, or people that want to pick up the pieces after a bad relationship or a bad marriage and start over and be a better human being. That's really what my content is all about. But this episode in particular, I want to talk about marriage because marriage has changed. It has changed drastically over the past 100 years. And I want to go over a little history lesson with this episode. Why should you listen to me? I'm just a dude that's a medical professional, a business owner. I've been married for 20 plus years. I've been a lifelong learner, coached hundreds of people. I've seen the same things over and over. And marriage is not dead. It's a beautiful thing when it's done right. My background, I grew up in the Midwest, rural Midwest. I saw a lot of changes over my lifetime. I am approaching 50 years old, and I'm a Gen X latchkey kid. And we've been through a lot as a generation, and we've seen a lot of changes. But for our generation, for Gen X people in particular, we have seen dramatic changes. The entire world has changed multiple times in our lifetime. In this episode, I'm going to talk about some historical changes, some cultural changes over a timeline. All of these things have an impact on families and marriage. Every one of these things do, okay? So let's go all the way back to the late 19th century, late 1800s. Let's talk about the Industrial Revolution first. The Industrial Revolution changed the world. We went from a predominantly agriculture-based economy to a more industrial lifestyle. So why do I mention agriculture in particular? The Industrial Revolution moved us away from an agricultural-based culture where men were raised by other men in the fields. It was hard work. Not only did men spend a lot of time with their fathers, but they spent time with their father's father, their uncles, their cousins. All of these men worked together in the fields back in the day before the Industrial Revolution because it was all manpower. Families were really started to help around the farm. They had a lot of babies back then because they needed help at making their life. Well, the Industrial Revolution started to change that. It modernized farming. It required less manpower to farm a 200-acre field, which was pretty common back then. And we went from horse-drawn plows to tractors and cars. All of those things made a huge difference in our culture, in Western culture particularly. So that brings us into the early 20th century. Now, a lot of guys in my comment section, a lot of my critics will always mention one thing. They mention feminism and how women have changed over the course of the last 50 years. Maybe, but women couldn't even vote until 1920. Yeah, women have changed in that time frame. That was 100 years ago. But the Industrial Revolution basically ushered our way into that. So after the 1920s, of course, it was the Great Depression in the United States, a drastic effect on our culture. And there was actually a huge dip in marriage at that time frame because usually, generally speaking, if the economy is doing great, people have a tendency to get married. If it's not doing that great, they have a tendency to stay away from marriage or delay it. Obviously, the Great Depression, things weren't that great at that point, so a lot of people didn't get married. And then followed shortly after that was World War II. World War II, there was a drastic increase in people that got married to the point where it actually had the highest rate ever recorded, which was 16.2 per 1,000. So that's a large amount. Basically, at that time frame, right at World War II, right after World War II particularly, everyone was married, essentially. I believe it was 98% of women who were of eligible age, of childbearing age, were married at that time frame. Right after World War II, we were out of the Great Depression. Industrialization was in full force. Things were really great, and we had a baby boom. Uh, Everybody was married. A lot of people were having a lot of babies because they were actually incentivized to have big families, and they did in full force. And that brought us through the 1950s. And then mid 1960s is where the biggest change of the 20th century happened, which was hormonal birth control. Hormonal birth control introduction into society was the biggest change in the 20th century. It freed women from the risk of pregnancies, even when they were married. So it freed women from that risk. What it also did was it made sex a lot cheaper for men to achieve. So back in the day, in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, you went through a dating process, had to get approval through the family to even go on dates. There was a lot of energy invested in that. Well, when hormonal birth control came around, women could be more promiscuous and not have that risk of having a baby, which made sex a lot cheaper for men, and it basically caused the sexual revolution. Now, am I saying that's a bad thing? No, it's just what happened culturally. Technology got to the point where it dramatically changed culture. We find ourselves in a much different world than it was in 1900. 1970s, there was actually another big surge of marriages. There's actually a big spike in divorce as well. Something drastic happened in 1970. That's when no-fault divorce started. The first law that was enacted was actually signed by a president. Actually, at the time, it was Governor Reagan in California. He signed a law stating that there basically didn't have to be a reason stated to get a divorce. Before that time frame, it was much more difficult to get a divorce. Once that law was signed, things changed dramatically. And no-fault divorce is something that I see quite often with the manosphere guys, the incels, the people that show up in my comment section. They mentioned no-fault divorce, feminism, all of these things. Yeah, you've got a point there. No-fault divorce absolutely makes divorce much more readily accessible. It's still very difficult, and it's a very difficult process to go through, but it's much easier than it was. And really, as a result of the hormonal birth control, there was a major shift in the 70s where females were entering the workforce in droves. Massive amount of women were actually coming into the workplace because they could plan their family. And essentially back in the 70s, the economy was not good at all. Inflation rates were through the roof, out of control inflation. So women were essentially forced into the workplace at that time because that was the only way that they could make ends meet. And that trend in particular had a drastic effect on my life personally because that's when latchkey kids were born. If you don't know what a latchkey kid is, it's a kid that grew up without their parents' supervision. So when they went to school, they had a key to their home, essentially around their neck, so they could come home, unlock the door after school because their parents weren't home. It was a great time to grow up, to be honest with you. That's the environment I grew up in. That term would have been literally for me had it not been for the fact that we didn't lock our doors in central Iowa in the Midwest because it was relatively safe. But I was a latchkey kid. So throughout the 70s and the 80s, kids were essentially left to fend for themselves. Huge change in culture at that point. That really wasn't the way it was before that time frame because mothers had a tendency to stay in home. Guys went out and brought home the bacon, right? Well, with the advent of hormonal birth control and the fact that women were getting more highly educated, they were getting pushed into the workforce, kids were left to fend for themselves. There was a huge wave of parents pushing girls and young women into education so that they could fend for themselves economically. They wouldn't have to rely on a husband. They wouldn't have to rely on a marriage to function and eat and feed themselves and have a good life. I saw that personally. A lot of girls were being pushed to become professionals, highly educated, and be workers at that point. Is that a wrong thing? No, not at all. It just happened. The main reason why that happened was because boomers, baby boomers, and the greatest generation were raising Gen X girls differently than they were raised. And another bad byproduct of all of these things is divorce was very, very common at this time. I saw a lot of families get destroyed about this time frame. You know, some marriages I'm sure needed to end. There's a lot of toxic relationships out there. But I did see a lot of my classmates, my friends have their parents split up. I was fortunate enough to have parents that stayed together. Another thing that was different back then was that boys my age grew up without a whole lot of male supervision. So we basically learned from each other. We played a lot of games. We rode a lot of bikes. We got in a lot of trouble, hurt ourselves usually. And we just learned from each other, and we grew up hard that way. And at that time frame, so the early 80s to the mid 80s, like I said, I grew up in rural Iowa. My grandfolks are farmers, and a dramatic change happened in the 80s. There was a massive drop in family farming. There was actually a big farming crisis right around 1984, 1985, where many family farms went under, including my grandparents, and it changed the landscape literally. The economy where I grew up was based almost all solely on agriculture, and that had a dramatic shift to more service, industrial jobs. So we went away from agriculture, and small towns suffered greatly. So what the byproduct of that was a mass exodus from rural areas to the cities. That is, I can't stress enough how important that was for culture, for family, for marriages, for just relationships in general. Why do I say that? Well, what happened was when people moved to the city, they moved away from extended family. And what happened was a lot of people felt that kids were more of a burden, and they had to put off having families a lot more to get settled into the cities because they didn't have the help that they once did with their grandparents, their aunts, uncles, cousins. They didn't have that anymore. So they were basically on their own in a city, and they put off getting married to settle in on a job or move. All of those things had a dramatic effect on the family. So if you've made it this far into the episode, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out. For those that have already subscribed to me, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We're just getting started. All right, so that brings us to the 90s. A massive amount of technology exploded at this time. The cable TV started. Before that, we had 4 channels, VCR tapes. You know, it was a much different life back then. And then the Gulf War hits in the early 90s, and CNN starts up. The 24-hour news cycle starts up at that point. What happened was a byproduct of that, from what I saw, is that parents became much more scared. They would hear about wars, they would hear about kidnappings, all of these things, and then helicopter parenting started really happening at that time frame because a lot of people were just scared. Kid-centric marriage really boomed at this point, and it's got worse till today. Leagues, AAU leagues, these year-round tournaments, this travel leagues, all of that stuff boomed at that point. That didn't exist when I was a child, and it really got big right around the early 90s. And so there's a lot of kid activities, and marriages really became really kid-centered. Then by the mid-90s, the internet hit. The first time I ever heard about the internet, I was actually a freshman in college. I know I'm dating myself that way, but that was the very first time that I actually used the internet. I remember specifically search engines blew my mind because before that, You had to use reference materials like encyclopedias. Well, all of a sudden, you had the search engine that you could search anything on the web. It was mind-blowing to me at the time. And something else happened with the advent of the internet and pornography, porn. That, in my opinion, from a guy's perspective, that was really the biggest internet. That was really the biggest impact of the internet. The joke at the time is when you got your internet hooked up, if you're in an apartment, you got access to porn. It was really a joke back then because it was really that prominent and that true. So that was the 90s. Now to the early 2000s. Napster and LimeWire provided a big-time evolution at that point. If you don't know what LimeWire was, it was a sharing website where you could download music and download porn clips. I mean, it was very readily accessible. Dial-up internet speeds were very, very slow at the time, so downloading a song didn't take that long. Downloading a clip of porn or like an image was pretty easy at that time frame. And I never even owned a cell phone until 2003. It was a flip phone. That's where MySpace came in. I know it sounds funny to mention MySpace anymore, but that was huge. You can get in contact with your classmates via the web. 2006, Facebook comes around, completely changes everything. All of a sudden, you've got social media now. Dramatically changed the world again for the fifth or sixth time in my lifetime. And at that point, you can easily get in contact with anybody in the world. Anybody in the world. Well, if you can easily contact somebody in the world, you can easily get in contact with an old girlfriend or old boyfriend or even a potential girlfriend. All of these things make a difference. And then 2007, the introduction of the iPhone, the smartphone. Totally changed the world again, where you have a pocket computer essentially with access to anybody in the world, any information in the world, just at your fingertips. Now, another thing that you had access to was unlimited porn at your fingertips. You could take it with you at this point. You didn't have to have a big desktop computer anymore. You had it on your phone. Pornhub started at this point. Xhamster, these streaming platforms started up at that point, and it had a dramatic impact on relationships, marriage, family, young men. And it was interesting because there's a dramatic decrease in birth rate at the same time frame. Now, granted, it was the same time frame as the Great Recession of 2008, but you catching my drift? A lot of these things make an impact on marriage and family. These are the early 2000s is where technology just exploded and had a huge impact on relationships, marriage, family. Instant messaging apps became popular, where those apps could be easily used to start emotional affairs. If you look at the top 5 reasons of divorce, infidelity is either at the top of the list or number 2, almost in every single source that I've ever seen. It's very, very easy nowadays to start an affair or find a partner to start an affair with. 2014, that's when dating apps were introduced. Match.com was a thing all the way back to the early 2000s, but dating apps show themselves right around 2012-ish, and so casual hookups had a huge boom. Sex becomes even more cheap for guys, and dating takes a massive hit. Ever since dating apps were prominent, were on smartphones where you could have access to all of these people, the dating has dramatically suffered. Gen Z in particular, Gen Z is the age of my children. I've got 2 teenagers, and it's a difficult process for them to go through to date. They really don't know how to do it. With all of the technology that they have, the texting apps, the Snapchats, all of these things, if you text somebody and you don't call them and actually talk to them, How are you going to hear tone and voice or see the facial expressions? It's changed a lot, and it's not for the better. So will that affect marriage? 100%. How can you get married if you can't date? Right? So there you go. And that basically brings us to now. Okay. Is marriage dead? No, it's not. That's why I named my channel Marriage Isn't Dead. It is not dead. Has marriage changed? 100%. It has changed dramatically in my lifetime, and especially in the 20th century. If you look at the early 20th century till the latter part of the 20th century, it has changed dramatically. Is it dead? Absolutely not. So let's go over some of the changes that have happened in summary, and I'll shut this down. Number one, men nowadays aren't men like they used to be back when agriculture was the primary way of living. They're just not raised the same. I wasn't raised the same as my grandfather was at all. I wasn't raised the same way as my father was, basically because culture has changed. The world changed. So humanity has changed. So number two, women don't prioritize marriage and kids and family as much as they used to. Do they still? Yes, but not as much as they used to, okay? They have a tendency to put off marriage. They have a tendency to put off having kids to better their career, to be more stable financially. They can't afford kids. Well, ladies, there is a biological clock, okay? Men can put it off into their 30s without a problem. But for ladies, if you put off having a family and having kids into your late 30s, it's going to be difficult. Your fertility rate is going to be much less, generally speaking. But if you look at the statistics, the sweet spot is right around 25 to 26 years old. Getting married at about 25 or 26, you have the strongest likelihood of staying married the rest of your life. That's what the stats say. If you wait too long, it goes down. If you get married too early, your chances of divorce are pretty high. The sweet spot is right around 25 years of age. So you can walk and chew bubble gum at the same time, ladies and guys. You can develop yourself and develop your career while you have a relationship at the same time. In my opinion, that's what it's all about. Having a great relationship with somebody else, having a good partner in life where you develop together and you grow together, it's really the basis of why I'm so happy. And I want that for you. I've coached for 5 years. I've heard it all, basically, and it really does come down to the same stuff. Couples over time will grow apart. The secret of staying married and staying happily married is growing together. And that's what this channel is all about. That's what my content's all about. And frankly, guys, this one's going to hurt. The last little thing that's changed marriage and families is really women don't need men anymore economically. They don't. Back in the day, in the early 20th century, women needed men to survive and to eat and to have a family. Well, nowadays, my wife is a professional. There's nothing wrong with any of that if that's your choice. If you want to be a homemaker, I think it's the most important job in the world, personally. Can you be a professional and stay happily married? Yeah, that's what my wife and I are doing. Guys, women don't need us anymore when it comes to economics. They just don't. But is it hopeless? No. What's happened is marriage has changed to be more focused on companionship, teamwork, and compatibility rather than necessity. Is that a bad thing? Not at all. It's just changed. The genetic programming we have to pair, bond, and have kids and have families, and to raise a family, to provide for them, and to protect them, all of that genetic programming is still there. Marriage rates for the past 10 years have stayed unchanged. Right now, it's about 6 per 1,000. The peak was 16.4 per 1,000 back in World War II. Now it's 6 per 1,000, which essentially that's about 40% less than it was back in the baby boomer generation. Is marriage dead? Absolutely not. That's a lot of people. That's 2 million marriages a year just in the United States. So it is still very, very common. It's just changed. It's just different now. And it's not a bad thing. A lot of people are really just trying to catch up with it. A lot of people didn't really know what a healthy relationship looks like to begin with. That's what I'm here for. That's what I'm trying to teach you, and I'm trying to convey that so that you can have a great marriage that lasts a lifetime. The world is catching up. We have a tendency to learn over time, but there's been so many changes over the past 100 years that it's been difficult. It's been a difficult process. But I think we're there at this point. I think it's stabilized at this point. That's just my generally speaking, or that's just me. Take it or leave it, but stick around. My channel is devoted to helping you find a good marriageable partner, maintaining a good marriage over time, having a fun marriage over time, and just being a happy individual in life. That's what this channel is all about. Stick around. We're just getting started. If you made it this long, I really appreciate it. Hit that subscribe button, make a comment. I'd love to hear from you. If you've got if you want to debate, it's all good. Bring it on. Okay. These are just my observations. So until next time, be better than you were yesterday and be desirable.